Hi, everyone. Today we're going to be reading the first part of Hatchet. As always, I'm going to be pointing some things out to you as the story is going along, especially based on our characters, our setting, our plot, main character, minor characters, as well as we're going to start looking at theme. So I want you paying attention to what's really happening in the story and know that I am going to be grading questions as that we go along. So make sure you're truly paying attention. If you are struggling with answering a question, you can go back and rewatch that clip of the story so you can get a better understanding. Today's story is called Hatchet. It is written by Gary Paulson. Gary Paulson actually is a really famous author. He has an entire series on survival, and this story Hatchet is actually just a clip from a larger series. So today we're going to be reading pages 12 through 19. One thing I wanted to point out to you is up here in the top right corner, this is a clip that's going to give you some background information on what you would have already read if you were reading the entire chapter book. So this gives you a little bit of backstory on it. I also wanted to point out to you the scenery, the setting of our book so far. If you look at our front cover, we are seeing a lot of wilderness, a lot of outdoors, a lot of no people, no shelters, definitely that pure definition of wilderness that we learned about yesterday. And if you look here, we're again seeing clips of that wilderness in the background. So make sure you are paying attention, and we are going to start with Hatchet.
Brian is on his way to visit his father in northern Canada when the pilot of the small single-engine plane in which he is flying suffers a fatal heart attack. Forced to crash land the plane, Brian suddenly finds himself alone in the Canadian wilderness with only a hatchet to help him survive. At first, he thought it was a growl. In the still darkness of the shelter in the middle of the night, his eyes came open, and he was awake, and he thought there was a growl. But it was the wind. A medium wind in the pines had made some sound that brought him up, brought him awake. He sat up and was hit with the smell. It terrified him. The smell was one of rot, some musty rot that made him think only of graves with cobwebs and dust and old death. His nostrils widened, and he opened his eyes wider, but he could see nothing. It was too dark, too hard dark, with clouds covering even the small light from the stars, and he could not see. But the smell was alive, alive and full and in the shelter. He thought of the bear, thought of Bigfoot and every monster he had ever seen in every fright movie he had ever watched, and his heart hammered in his throat. Then he heard the slithering. A brushing sound. A slithering, brushing sound near his feet, and he kicked out as hard as he could, kicked out and threw the hatchet at the sound, a noise coming from his throat. But the hatchet missed, sailed into the wall where it hit the rocks with a shower of sparks, and his leg was instantly torn with pain, as if 100 needles had been driven into it.
So one thing I wanted to point out to you guys while you were reading is I want you really trying to picture in your mind where he is and what might be after him at this current moment, especially when they're talking about the slithering sound, a brushing sound near his feet. All throughout here, you're really going to see that intricate imagery detail that you can picture in your mind. We also see our first mention of the word hatchet, which is what our story is called.
Now he screamed, with the pain and fear, and skittered on his backside up into the corner of the shelter, breathing through his mouth, straining to see, to hear. The slithering moved again. He thought toward him at first, and terror took him, stopping his breath. He felt he could see a low, dark form, a bulk in the darkness, a shadow that lived, but now it moved away. Slithering and scraping, it moved away, and he saw, or thought he saw it, go out of the door opening. He lay on his side for a moment. then pulled a rasping breath in and held it, listening for the attacker to return. When it was apparent that the shadow wasn't coming back, he felt the calf of his leg, where the pain was centered and spreading to fill the whole leg. His fingers gingerly touched a group of needles that had been driven through his pants and into the fleshy part of his calf. They were stiff and very sharp on the ends that stuck out, and he knew then what the attacker had been. A porcupine had stumbled into his shelter, and when he had kicked it, the thing had slapped him with its tail of quills.
So, this creature, I don't know what you were picturing it to be, but we find out later that it is a porcupine. If you don't know what a porcupine is, it's a small animal that has quills, which are kind of like long needles. They are anywhere from 8 inches to a foot and a half long, and they come out of the animal only when it feels threatened.
He touched each quill carefully. The pain made it seem as if dozens of them had been slammed into his leg, but there were only 8, pinning the cloth against his skin. He leaned back against the wall for a minute. He couldn't leave them in. They had to come out. But just touching them made the pain more intense. So fast, he thought. So fast things change. When he'd gone to sleep, he had satisfaction, and in just a moment it was all different. He grasped one of the quills, held his breath, and jerked. It sent pain signals to his brain in tight waves. But he grabbed another, pulled it, then another quill. When he had pulled 4 of them, he stopped for a moment. The pain had gone from being a pointed injury pain to spreading in a hot smear up his leg, and it made him catch his breath. Some of the quills were driven in deeper than others, and they tore when they came out. He breathed deeply twice, let half of the breath out, and went back to work. Jerk, pause, jerk, and 3 more times before he lay back in the darkness. Done. The pain filled his leg now, and with it came new waves of self-pity. Sitting alone in the dark, his leg aching, some mosquitoes finding him again, he started crying. It was all too much, just too much, and he couldn't take it. Not the way it was. I can't take it this way, alone, with no fire, and in the dark. And next time it might be something worse, maybe a bear. And it wouldn't be just quills in the leg. It would be worse. I can't do this, he thought, again and again. I can't. Brian pulled himself up until he was sitting upright back in the corner of the cave. He put his head down on his arms across his knees, with stiffness taking his left leg, and cried until he was cried out. He did not know how long it took, but later he looked back on this time of crying in the corner of the dark cave and thought of it as when he learned the most important rule of survival, which was that feeling sorry for yourself didn't work. It wasn't just that it was wrong to do or that it was considered incorrect. It was more than that. It didn't work. When he sat alone in the darkness and cried, and was done, was all done with it, nothing had changed. His leg still hurt. It was still dark. He was still alone. And the self-pity had accomplished nothing. At last, he slept again. But already his patterns were changing, and the sleep was light, a resting doze more than a deep sleep, with small sounds awakening him twice in the rest of the night. In the last doze period before daylight, before he awakened finally with the morning light and the clouds of new mosquitoes, he dreamed. This time, it was not of his mother, but of his father at first, and then of his friend Terry. In the initial segment of the dream, his father was standing at the side of a living room looking at him, and it was clear from his expression that he was trying to tell Brian something. His lips moved, but there was no sound, not a whisper. He waved his hands at Brian, made gestures in front of his face as if he were scratching something, and he worked to make a word with his mouth, but at first Brian could not see it. Then the lips made an shape, but no sound came. Ma. Brian could not hear it. could not understand it, and he wanted to so badly. It was so important to understand his father, to know what he was saying. He was trying to help, trying so hard. And when Brian couldn't understand, he looked cross, the way he did when Brian asked questions more than once. And he faded. Brian's father faded into a fog place Brian could not see. And the dream was almost over, or seemed to be, when Terry came. He was not gesturing to Brian, but was sitting in the park at a bench looking at a barbecue pit, and for a time nothing happened. Then he got up and poured some charcoal from a bag into the cooker, then some starter fluid, and he took a flick type of lighter and lit the fluid. When it was burning and the charcoal was at last getting hot, he turned, noticing Brian for the first time, in the dream. He turned and smiled and pointed to the fire as if to say, "See, a fire." But it meant nothing to Brian, except that he wished he had a fire. He saw a grocery sack on the table next to Terry. Brian thought it must contain hot dogs and chips and mustard, and he could think only of the food. But Terry shook his head and pointed again to the fire. And twice more he pointed to the fire, made Brian see the flames, and Brian felt his frustration and anger rise. And he thought, all right, I see the fire, but so what? I don't have a fire. I know about fire. I know I need a fire. I know that.
So, just a reminder that Terry is one of his friends from back before he was trapped. And I want you thinking about what Brian is learning right now in the story. What is he taking away from this dream that he is having with his dad and his friend Terry? And what things is he learning from that?
His eyes opened, and there was light in the cave, a gray dim light of morning. He wiped his mouth and tried to move his leg, which had stiffened like wood. There was thirst and hunger, and he ate some raspberries from the jacket. They had spoiled a bit, seemed softer and mushier, but still had a rich sweetness. He crushed the berries against the roof of his mouth with his tongue and drank the sweet juice as it ran down his throat. A flash of metal caught his eye, and he saw his hatchet in the sand where he had thrown it at the porcupine in the dark. He scooched up, wincing a bit when he bent his stiff leg, and crawled to where the hatchet lay. He picked it up and examined it and saw a chip in the top of the head. The nick wasn't large, but the hatchet was important to him, was his only tool, and he should not have thrown it. He should keep it in his hand and make a tool of some kind to help push an animal away. Make a staff, he thought, or a lance, and save the hatchet. Something came then, a thought, as he held the hatchet, something about the dream and his father and Terry, but he couldn't pin it down. Ah! He scrambled out and stood in the morning sun and stretched his back muscles and his sore leg. The hatchet was still in his hand, and as he stretched and raised it over his head, it caught the first rays of the morning sun.
So, for those of you that don't quite understand yet what a hatchet is, it's right here. This is a good example or picture of it in the background. I want you thinking about before we read the next section tomorrow, what what was his dad and Terry trying to show him and teach him? He is equally as frustrated with this situation as his dad and Terry were in the story, but he is really struggling to pin down what they were trying to tell him. This is all we're reading today. Make sure you have answered all of your questions to the best of the ability. Make sure, too, that if some of the questions have more than one question in it, you are answering the question completely. Please do not look up answers on Google. It is very evident when you guys do that because I have about 15 kids submitting the same answers. So that's when I know that you are Google searching your answers, friends. Okay? I will see you later. Thank you for listening today.